Now, the next firewall architecture type is One-Legged DMZ, and it consists of one firewall, internal network, and external network. So in terms of the number of components, it's still the same as the screen subnet firewall. Now the difference is, in the screen subnet firewall you had only two networks interfacing the firewall, the internal network and the external network. In this case, however, the firewall is interfacing three different networks. So the first one is of course the internet, the second one is what we call DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, and then the third network is the internal network you're trying to protect. So the idea behind this firewall is, since one of the biggest drawbacks of the screen subnet firewall was that you couldn't really protect some of these more sensitive hosts from other internal hosts within the same network. And although we have only one firewall, by introducing another firewall interface, you could separate, for example, the hosts that need more protection, for example the ones in the internal network, from the hosts that need probably less protection. So in the picture it's clear that you have one network interface connecting to the internet, the other network interface connecting to the DMZ network, and then finally the third interface connecting to the internal network. And what's nice about this is, basically, first of all, some of these internal hosts are separated into the ones in the DMZ and then the other ones in the internal network, and whatever, for example, traffic going in between the DMZ here and the internal network can be monitored by the firewall, because that's the only way the network traffic can go from the DMZ network to the internal network, or from the internal network to the DMZ network. In the screen subnet firewall, this wasn't possible because everything was, behind the firewall in the same network. So once they are behind the firewall communicating with each other behind the firewall, there wasn't any oversight by the firewall, because everything was just happening between the hosts behind the firewall. So the biggest thing to remember about this firewall is there is another dedicated port, in this case in a router, used as a firewall that serves as a DMZ port. So in addition to the two ports found in the screen subnet firewall, this one has 3 ports. Now the most famous DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, in the world is in between North Korea and South Korea. The DMZ we're talking about in networking is completely different from the DMZ between North Korea and South Korea. The DMZ, the physical DMZ between North Korea and South Korea, the main purpose of it is to provide some sort of a buffer zone between the two confronting parties. So in this case, North Korea and South Korea, to avoid any potential conflicts. Because if they're just so close to each other, or too close to each other, they may get into a fight very easily. So they came up with DMZ to separate the two parties in this conflict, almost eternal conflict, in between this place called DMZ. So to summarize, the one-legged DMZ had its own advantages, such as it's still cost effective because we're still using only one firewall, and I already mentioned this, but the internal hosts are still monitored when they access the internal servers. So I mean the servers in the DMZ, and the other way around is also true. And the external hosts have no access to internal hosts at all. I mean, especially directly, because the idea is we would only give access to the hosts in the DMZ in terms of services necessary for the external hosts. So for example, if you need to set up a web server in your network, you would put it in the DMZ because your firewall will only allow requests to the DMZ, not to anything in the internal network. So this way the hosts in the internal network are very well protected. Now, some of the disadvantages of this approach is the complexity, because instead of somehow interfacing only two networks, now the firewall has three different interfaces, and you need more complicated configuration to set up those three different interfaces. And whenever the complexity increases, there is a chance of an error. And another even bigger problem could be when this firewall in the middle fails, nothing will work. So the firewall will be almost like a single point of failure. So when it fails, everything fails.